afternoon and good day wherever you are, those who are connected online. Welcome to this session. And I think we are all pretty much aware of the needs for boards and the expectations that we have for boards to understand corporate culture and the role it plays in supporting strategy and in building healthy organizations. However, we know little about the mechanisms to shape culture, about the link between culture and strategy and its effect on corporate performance. And I'm sure that this session will be thought-provoking and will help us advancing in this direction. Let me introduce you to Robert Gibson. Bob is he's connected online from Boston. He's this long distinguished professor of management at MIT's Sloan School of Management, and he's also a professor of economics professor in MIT's Department of Economics. He received his undergraduate from Harvard University, his master's degree from Cambridge, and his PhD from the Stanford Graduate School of Business. He has been a faculty member at Cornell University and a visiting professor at Princeton. And he holds research positions at Harvard University and at the National Bureau of Economic Research. He's best known for his research on organizational design and performance. And he leads the MIT Sloan's research program on innovation in markets and organizations. And he's the founding director of the working group in organizational economics at the National Bureau of Economic Research. His work on organizational culture and capabilities focuses on how people can collaborate better together and how the norms inside an organization can be changed, taking as a starting point where the organization is. He has published over 100 articles in a variety of journals, and his research has been cited over 30,000 times. He has held editorial positions such as he's been the co-editor of the Journal of Labor Economics and associate editor of the Journal of Economic Perspectives and of the Quarterly Journal of Economics. He has also published 3 books, and in addition to numerous research and teaching awards, he was elected as a fellow of both the Society of Labor Economists and of the Econometric Society. My dear colleague and friend, Bruno Cassiman, will discuss Bob's work. And Bruno has been a professor at IESE's Strategic Management Department for over 2 decades. And this year he moved to Belgium, his home country, where he's a professor of strategy at KU Leuven, while he still holds a visiting position with us at IESE, for which we are very happy. He has a PhD in managerial economics and decision sciences from Northwestern University, and a degree in engineering and management from KU Leuven. Throughout his career, Bruno has been visiting professor at Harvard Business School, London Business School, and Melbourne Business School. His research relates to the economics of strategy and innovation, with a particular focus on the connections between science and industry in the innovation process and on the complementarity between different innovation activities. He has also published numerous articles in leading academic and managerial journals, and his work is widely cited. He's been department editor of the Business Strategy Department at Management Science and editorial board member at various academic journals. He has also been a consultant to the European Commission and the Belgian, the Flemish, and the Catalan governments on matters on innovation policy. And also consultant to several companies on matters related to innovation strategy. So without further ado, let me give the floor to Robert Gibson, who will present his work on culture and strategy.
Thank you. Now let's see if I can move the slides. But first, thank you for that very kind introduction. I thought the questions at the beginning were excellent. I'm afraid I may only reiterate the questions rather than shed any light on the answers, but here we go. Let's see. Does that move it? No, all right, let's try this way. Moving, excellent, good, good, good. Okay, let me begin with wishes and apologies. I really wish I could be there. It just couldn't work out, so that's presence. I really wish I had a paper for this talk, but I don't yet. And so let me apologize also to Bruno, as well as to everyone, especially to Bruno, who has the impossible job of, sort of rational expectations, guessing what I might say and discussing that. Bruno, you should just have full license to say whatever you want, I think. And then lastly, Paul, it's nice to see you. I didn't make it up for your presentation. Rudy and Ruth, I made it for half of your collective remarks, and Alex and Xavier, the whole thing. Alex, it was startling to hear my name in your presentation. I looked it up. If I'm doing the math correctly, the last time I worked on executive compensation, you were starting high school. So that's a long time ago. So I've stolen a screenshot from Ruth's slides here, and I'll come back to that. But those were very interesting, and I'm happy to hear the rest of the presentations after this one. Let me start with two pieces of background that relate to things you've just heard. So I'm not in accounting or strategy or finance. I'm in economics, and in particular, I'm in organizational economics. And as we tenured people get to do, I get to indulge, I suppose is a good word, indulge my obsession. My obsession is the question, what can an economist do to help a fixed set of people collaborate better together? And I'm working over many years, and I hope many more, towards a possible answer, which is described at the bottom here. So an economist might be able to describe the concept and role of equilibrium to the parties, might facilitate the parties in building such an equilibrium. And I say in square brackets at the very bottom, others may have different views, or I'm going to ask for help on part of this view later. I think a lot of this has to do with life inside one organization, intra-organizational issues. But I think an alliance can have a culture. I think a lot of this stuff also applies between organizations to inter-organizational issues. And we'll come back to that as we go along. Okay, background number two, the visible hands part of the title came before the strategy and culture part of the title. And then at some point I thought, gee, I wonder if for this conference I have that the wrong way around. So let me say a little bit about strategy and culture before I get into visible hands and building equilibrium. Oh gosh, sorry. There we go. The strategy part, I think, is straightforward. What I hope to be about today relates to competitive advantage and core capabilities, also to corporate strategy, including the part of corporate strategy that studies alliances and other extended enterprises. So I hope strategy people hear pieces of those issues. The culture part is harder, and honestly, culture is just harder than strategy, at least in my opinion. There's a quotation we like to use from time to time that says that culture is one of the most complicated words in the English language. So here we go. Looking ahead to where I'll try and go in these remarks, I want to distinguish between what you might call societal culture versus organizational culture. I will want to be talking about a bunch of ideas that their authors don't call culture. For example, culture is not in the index of Sired and March. It's not in the index of Nelson and Winter. But I think they're talking about related things. And if you gave me just 6 words to try to describe where I'm going to try to go, they would be the 6 from the anthropologist Clifford Geertz at the bottom of the slide. Culture is public because meaning is. And so public in his usage means shared. Meaning, I think, is related to interpretation. And so for me and for Geertz, I understand culture is going to be about shared interpretation. Okay, so here's an outline of where I hope to go, just 3 or 4 minutes per bullet, and then we'll be done. Chandler, of course, had the beautiful title, Visible Hands. I want to think about visible hands beyond his original empirical setting. Ronald Coase, of course, wrote the paper that started organizational economics, and I'll talk about, I think, an implication of his ideas that visible hands do what contracts cannot. Oliver Williamson was one of the first people to start talking about how so-called relational contracts, abbreviated here, RELCON, maybe relational contracts can do what formal contracts cannot. Rebecca Henderson woke me up to the clarity problem associated with relational contracts. The game theoretic literature has been all about the credibility problem. David Krebs in 1990 talked about how such equilibria, relational contracts are repeated game equilibria, as we'll discuss, might be part of culture. And then I have it in light gray because it's the sort of bleeding edge. Maybe I should have had it in red or something, but it's gray, hard to see for me anyway. I think there's something to be said about the role of stories and other things as managerial techniques for both naming and framing, which I think are two issues that arise when you have clarity problems. So that's what I will try to say in the next few minutes. So visible hands beyond Chandler's firms. You know, Chandler wrote an empirical book, so he had to be about some circumscribed domain, which was, I think, even manufacturing firms, not just firms. I think he would have said, sure, there are visible hands in hospitals and schools and agencies and other organizations with one boss. I don't know if Chandler would have said there are visible hands in legislatures, but there's a beautiful paper and a beautiful title by Weingast and Marshall that says, why legislatures, like firms, are not organized as markets. So if the choice is between visible hands versus the invisible hand, legislatures clearly go on the visible hand side, even if they don't have one boss. And then there's the point I was making before that I think this is not the time to go into all these bullets, but there are just lots and lots of people talking about the roles of visible hands between organizations. So I'll summarize in the box at the bottom and say non-integration, meaning that we have at least two parties, maybe two firms, is not necessarily, quote unquote, the market of Adam Smith and the invisible hand. Oliver Williamson went down a line like this. I don't know how much Williamson some of you have read. It takes a little getting used to. By now, I've read a lot of Williamson, and this all makes sense to me. I hope it makes sense to you. He says in 1973, I submit that substantially the same factors that are ultimately responsible for market failures of the invisible hand, also explain failures of internal organization. So you shouldn't expect a smoothly functioning organization, even if you choose to integrate rather than be non-integrated and transact in a market. He goes on to say, and I'll try to illustrate this, if this contention is correct, the study of alternative modes of economic organization, he basically means bosses versus contracts, can proceed in a symmetrical fashion. Rather than having to devise a separate apparatus for each organizing mode, a common language and conceptual apparatus can be brought systematically to bear across modes. So where I'm going to go with that is basically from Coase, Ronald Coase, to culture, if you will. I fully agree with Williamson, and I want to argue that we're not going to understand the design and performance and management of either organizations or alliances until we start working more and more than organizational economics has so far anyway, with what you might call culture. Just to put a picture up from Williamson, this is the way he looked at the world in '79, arguably his most important paper. On the left, y-axis, we have how often are you interacting, only occasionally or often, recurrently. Across the x-axis, across the top, is it something with lots of substitutes or mixed or highly idiosyncratic? And all I really want you to see is that whether it's unified, by which he meant one boss, or bilateral, by which he meant two bosses, he's envisioning what he's calling relational contracts in both cases. And so that's his one approach to the two domains of interest. Okay, so how about Coase? Many of you will know this paper extremely well, started organizational economics. I think it's often summarized as, if markets were perfect, would we need firms? Let me, for purposes of today, summarize it differently. I think of Coase as telling us, if contracts were perfect, would we need bosses? I think for reasons of time, I love what Chester Barnard had to say. I love what Jim March had to say. I love the distinction of Henry Mintzberg between analysis, what to do, and administration, getting it done. I also wish I knew what the analogs of Barnard, March, and Mintzberg were for alliances, for things between two organizations. But let me leave it with this Coasian rephrasing at the top. Let me spend more time on this from Nelson and Winter. This is an important book, as all the strategy people will know. This is chapter 5, certainly one of the important chapters in the book. This is the section of chapter 5 on routines, one of their key ideas, routines as truce. That's one word they use, truce. Another, down at the bottom, you see, they use the word equilibrium. Indeed, they use the adjective political equilibrium. And so the 2 points I'd like to make here, several really, but the striking ones are in green and yellow. The terms of a truce can never be fully explicit. That's going to be related to the clarity problem I'll try to talk about. There's a path dependence that they talk about here, a shared tradition arising out of the specific contingencies confronted and the responses, There's an inefficiency aspect. Perhaps I didn't need the middle paragraph. It's maybe summarized by the yellow at the bottom. Adaptations that appear obvious and easy to an external observer may be foreclosed because they involved a perceived threat to the internal political equilibrium. And so both the path dependence and the possible inefficiency, I think, are very important. Again, I would love to know more about analogous thinking between organizations. So we've basically illustrated the background slide number 1, that inefficiency is the scope for the possibility that an economist might help a fixed set of people collaborate better together. And borrowing the word from Nelson and Winter and the ideas as well from others, I think there's something to be said about building an equilibrium here. So let me move in that direction. If you want more on what we've just been talking about, that's one of the papers that was posted. Okay, so as I mentioned, Williamson started thinking about whether relational contracts might be able to do what formal contracts cannot. What is a relational contract? Well, here are 4 definitions, from least formal to most formal. A promise you can believe in, a shared understanding of the appropriate exercise of discretion. Note, shared understanding. That's related to Gertz on culture is public because meaning is. I'll skip the middle one just because it has so many words and end with the last one in magenta. A relational contract is an equilibrium of a repeated game. And so perhaps not surprisingly, those who know even a little game theory will say, yep, so they've studied the credibility problem of such promises in repeated games. I think much more importantly, there's a lot of empirical work and practical work. These are 2 of my colleagues at MIT and one of my co-conspirators at the Center for Advanced Study in Behavioral Sciences at Stanford. The top left is Kate Kellogg, who's a fantastic ethnographer who studied the difficulty of 2 hospitals, one of which managed to abide by a new rule about how many hours a surgery resident could work, and the other of which, the other hospital, is on probation because they couldn't. And it turned out that there were important details that were hard to understand and settle about. So when exactly should a particular resident go home? In view of the time, I'll just jump to Kat Turco on the upper right. Another of my colleagues, another fantastic ethnographer, studied a social media firm that had a very active internal wiki. Everybody in the organization was posting to the wiki, and the question arose, are we running this by majority rule, or do the founders have important decision rights? And the founders said, no. We're here to listen. We value your input, but we're going to make the decisions. And so how do you demonstrate at that point, after all this valuable feedback into the wiki so far, that you're actually listening? And that's a hard question. And a lot of her book is about, I think, building an equilibrium. She thinks that too, based on her citations. The last of these people is Shona Brown, not at MIT, ex-Google, and somebody I talked to a lot out at Stanford. The way she describes Google is that they were trying to build a new equilibrium. It was fragile. We had to reinforce it every day. So I could avoid using the word culture from here on. That's the problem I want to study. What does it mean to build a new equilibrium? What does it mean for an equilibrium to be fragile? What does it mean to reinforce it? And just to clarify, that's a lovely book by Shona on the bottom left, but it's in conversation that she makes the remark in the bottom right. Okay, so as I mentioned, Rebecca knocked on my door one day at MIT and said, Professor Gibbons, those relational contracts you guys work on, they're more important than you know. And I took that as, part compliment and part something like an insult or something in the best possible sense. And what she meant was, she thinks, and now I do too, that relational contracts are related to competitive advantage and core capabilities. And we didn't use the word culture, I don't think, in this organization science paper, but we did say there's a problem with the literature. The literature imagines that the parties know their strategies, and here I don't mean their business strategies or their competitive strategies, I mean their game theoretic strategies, what action party I might take in the state of the world S. The parties know each other's strategies in order to compute whether they're looking at a Nash equilibrium or not, in the simplest possible case. And yet, if these are supposed to be things that can't be captured in formal contracts, you might think that if a relational contract could be crystal clear, you could have captured it in a formal contract. So I think there's every reason to think that relational contracts, especially ones that are hard to copy, and that's of course necessary, a la J. Barney for competitive advantage. I think there's every reason to think that relational contracts are not going to be clear initially. And you have what we called a clarity problem, what I now also call a naming problem, or what you might call a knowing telling gap, a knowing telling problem. And so if you play out that kind of world where I can't explain to you fully how I hope we'll interact with each other, it leads to the magenta issue in the lower left here. Perhaps quite, with high probability, quite plausibly, it leads to a situation in which I try to articulate to you how I hope we'll behave. You think you're understanding me, and then I do something that you're not expecting. And in particular, I do something that's not good for you. And you then have to ask yourself, did we miscommunicate, or is Bob gaming me? And that's the piece of the game theoretic literature that I hope will come out of talks like this. I also think you see these issues. I didn't go backwards in the slides, I went forwards. This is the same slide, but that's what I take from these three discussions, is the relevance and the need for models of this question, did we miscommunicate, or am I being gamed? Okay, so since it's a conference about culture, let me use the word culture. And here I'm channeling David Krepps's 1990 paper. It was actually from a 1984 conference, where he uses the theory of repeated games to say that repeated game equilibria look to him like culture. And David was my advisor, so as a good student, let me sort of flesh out the non-economics that might help undergird that assertion by Krebs. So here's where Ruth's slide comes in. There absolutely is a definition of organizational culture from Charles O'Reilly and Jenny Chapman about values and norms. Very interesting. Let's see, why is that not moving? There we go. Sometimes my computer takes a little vacation. Sorry. All right, there we have it. And the next slide is to distinguish between names that appeared previously. Hofstede on the left, in the upper left here, in the book with the black cover, and Ed Schein, my former colleague at MIT, in the book with the orange and is that taupe or something color. And they're talking about two completely different notions of culture. That's the main point I want to make. And so O'Reilly and Chapman is a notion, Hofstede is a notion, Schein is a notion, Krebs is a notion. I think in view of the time, I will just summarize that one idea is that culture exists outside and seeps into an organization. The other idea, or another idea, is that culture is entirely built within an organization. And you could think that these have different timescales and different intentionality. So I'll say more about that in a second. So we've reached background number 2. And let me say a little bit more about sorting out the many, at least some of the many definitions of culture. So this is from the paper I was just showing. It's also up on the conference website, where our job, in fact, Jenny Chapman gave us this job, Jordan Siegel, Roberto Weber, and myself, to try to say something about, a little more about structuring the ways in which strategy and culture might interact with each other. And so we tried to describe culture in terms of these 4 dimensions. My time thinks I have about 8 minutes. Does that seem about right? Yeah, is that okay? Great. Okay, very good. Then I can slow down a little, having reached this slide. One question is, what's the setting for this culture? Is it a large group like a country, or a small group like a firm, understanding that some firms are bigger than some countries? Another question is, what's the source of this setting? Is it from the distant past or contemporaneous? Understanding that there are deceased founders that have important impacts on organizational cultures, and current societal events that have important impacts on societal cultures. A third is, and this gets closer to the O'Reilly-Chapman definition, what's the content? Is it about values that are somehow inside individuals, which an economist might model as in the utility function? Or is it beliefs? Is it closer to Clifford Geertz? Is it beliefs about others' interpretation? Am I confident that we're going to interpret some future state of the world, and what actions are therefore appropriate in that future state of the world the same way or not? And lastly, how do cultures change? Do they change from exogenous events only in the extreme case, or intentional actions only in the extreme case? And so, not surprisingly, you could line these up. And so what we call big C culture, roughly Hofstede, seeping into the organization, is 1A, 2A, 3A, and 4A. Of course, this is a 2 by 2 by 2 by 2. So that's 16 possibilities. I'm describing only 2 of them here, big C and little c. That leaves 14 more for us all to think about. And furthermore, I'm describing things as though there were only these binary distinctions, and really they're continuous. You could have sort of a middle point. And besides, you might have your own 5th or 6th dimensions in addition to these 4. But what I really want to say is, what I think Geertz and Schein and Krebs are talking about, and what I would like to talk about in this project on building equilibria, is this idea of, we're calling it little c culture, which is not 1A, 2A, 3A, and 4A, but instead 1B, 2B, 3B, and 4B. It's smallish group where the culture is formed absolutely and only from, just to take a theoretical case, absolutely and only from contemporaneous actions. It's all about meaning and common shared meaning, beliefs about others' interpretations, and it happens from intentional actions. I don't mean that big C culture is irrelevant, far from it. I don't mean that 1A, 2A, 3A, and 4A ought to be added, or it shouldn't be added to little c, but you got to start somewhere. So I'm starting with little c. Okay, so to finish up, stories. This is in gray again, because I don't know how to think about it yet. So I'm trying, and help from Bruno and everyone else would be very welcome now or later. Let's see. There we go. Yeah. So this is, pardon me, my clicker seems to be a little sticky. This is work with Larry Prusak, who's a knowledge management guru, who said at one point to a class of mine that he was helping with, culture is a weasel word. It means we can stop thinking now. So I love both the attitude and the precision of that statement. I agree with it. I think if there are 160 definitions of culture, we better be sharper about which definition we mean, whether we're academics trying to work on it or managers trying to change it. You can't go into your organization and say, let's change the culture. And if 13 different notions of what you mean by culture, not to mention how to change it, go off in people's heads, maybe that's the first problem. All right. So we started our paper by saying organizations are full of stories, organizational economics, not so much. I think that's really important. I think we're clearly missing an empirical part of organizations. And more importantly, if stories are so prominent in organizations, then why is that? Shouldn't our theory predict stories as being an important part? So I'm fascinated by these two essays by the psychologist Jerome Bruner and other work that he did on stories. He's talking about, Alex was mentioning Xavier Gibbons and Matthew Rabin and so on, behavioral economists. Bruner, as a psychologist, is also making a contribution that I hope will get folded into behavioral economics about two modes of thought. Let me just jump to how they differ in their procedures for verification. One verifies by eventual appeal to procedures for establishing formal and empirical proof. Okay, we know what that one is. That's how economics works. The other establishes not truth, but verisimilitude. Maybe I was too quick and too casual. Maybe economics actually importantly works the second way too. We just don't admit it. So Bruner's talking about the way our brains work, what kinds of things we learn through one mode or the other. And let me end with two last things. So first of all, on the naming problem, if you needed to communicate a strategy pair to yourself and your counterparty, and you couldn't do it precisely, which of course the game theoretic literature assumes that you can do precisely and perfectly and costlessly, oops, might you use a story? Well, so what is a story? So in literature, they tell us that a story is a status quo, a state of the world, if you will, or maybe the status quo is back here on the left. Then something happens, then somebody does something, and then there's a resolution. So in the nomenclature and variable names familiar from organizational economics, let's call that a S, A, and Y. The great thing about a story is it's sort of like one point defining a line, and it generalizes, it has legs, it suggests to people, oh, well, if that's the story you're telling me about a particular circumstance, I now have a view about what I should do in other circumstances. So if equilibrium involves a shared interpretation of what to do in particular circumstances, and if that interpretation depends on knowledge that's hard to talk about directly, tacit knowledge, and if a good story can leverage or transfer tacit knowledge, I would like to see models that have stories playing a role in building equilibrium. And why do I say I would like to have models that do that? It's not just because I do models, probably partly that, but also, Paul Samuelson at some point apparently said, facts only dent a theorist's hide. So I think we won't change economics. We won't see new kinds of economics taking stories seriously until we have models of it. Paul Krugman said, like it or not, an economic idea that isn't embalmed in a formal model has a very short half-life. So last slide before the title slide repeats as the conclusion. I haven't said anything about framing. Framing is, I think, even harder. What I mean by framing and what I think these various psychologists and others mean by framing is not the naming problem of trying to get on the same wavelength about what strategy pair I'm proposing that you and I use, but rather this is something, as DiMaggio calls it, constitutive. This is how you see the world. This is interpretation. So you wake up and, I see it half empty and you see it half full. We're looking at the same world. How do you change somebody's framing in that sense? All the way back to Goffman, who originated this. What situation is this? And so building that shared interpretation, I think, is is massively important. All right, according to my timer, I'm done, so I will stop. That's where at least I am trying to make sense of visible hands building an equilibrium that you might call culture. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bob. Bruno.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Bob.
Thank you.
The presentation. Also, thank you, Jordi. When Jordi invited me for the conference, obviously I was very happy to accept. But then I saw the title of the presentation, and it had like strategy and culture in organizations, and you get like 10 minutes to say something. Now, when we think about strategy in a typical strategy course, you would start with the discussion on what is strategy, and that can go on forever already. But always somebody will mention kind of like, well, what about values? What about culture? And they will say like, well, yeah, those are also very important. The issue is that it's very difficult for strategists to kind of like talk about culture and strategy at the same time, because I don't think we have the right language. And I think that's what Bob's trying to do here, is to kind of create a language and clear definitions. I mean, we saw today already, Marco started out one definition of strategy. Ruud gave another definition of strategy. Rudy gave another definition of strategy. And Bob kind of also presented yet another definition of strategy. So first we have to agree on what are we going to research to see whether or not it has an effect and which kinds of effects it has. And I think there's a lot of discussion on that today in terms of like, what do we actually want to measure? So I think Bob tries to get some headway there in terms of thinking about culture, and he talked about big C culture versus small C culture. That's the paper. He said we had a 2 by 2 by 2 by 2. Now there are different dimensions, but I think the most important dimension was the one where he had values versus beliefs or versus expectations in that paper. Now we can see that in the strategy literature as well, to talk about big C versus small c. Big C, I think in the international business literature has been used a lot in terms of differences between countries, and culture is obviously an important element. I like to refer to Pankaj Gamwat's framework on the cage model, where the C stands for cultural differences between countries. Obviously, companies getting into a different country will need to understand this difference in culture, but also difference in administration, distances in terms of economic outcomes, and differences in geography. But that we know actually relatively a lot. And I think also in the conference, we want to go to a different level of thinking about culture, and that's the small c culture that Bob raised. And then I think we all have our examples. We already saw some examples, but here as a strategist, I like to think about the same industry, the same environment, the same market, different companies with what would be kind of a different small c culture. And what does that mean? If we look in retailing, Mercadona versus Carrefour, people working there will experience very different things. Not only people working there, but also suppliers. Suppliers of Carrefour versus suppliers of Mercadona will be expecting very different interactions, because they treat suppliers differently. In Mercadona, you're more a partner. In Carrefour, every 3 years, you might have to renew the contract and make a better bid. So those are the types of culture and the organizational culture that we actually want to be looking at. I did have some questions, because Bob raised kind of the credibility and the clarity issue, but maybe some more clarity would be interesting in terms of what does it really mean. So indeed, credibility and clarity maybe through culture, but how? And so under which circumstances might there be more, or might there be less clarity? So for example, uncertainty in the environment. Does that create more or less clarity, more or less credibility? Technological change, fast technological change versus slow technological change. That would be quite helpful to kind of think about these issues of clarity and credibility. Critical events. How do firms react to critical events? I think we have very interesting experiments now. COVID, the pandemic. How did firms actually react to that? That will reveal actually whether or not there is clarity and credibility in terms of the cultural expectations that are around there. And then, for example, political statements that are being made by organizations. If Levi's goes out and positions itself against gun control, I mean, what does that kind of signal, and how is that helping clarity and credibility? Because obviously some of the customers might be gun owners, some not. Some of the employees might be gun owners and some not, and have different opinions on that. But I think the bigger question for me in terms of that 2 by 2 by 2 by 2 was then, when we think about values versus expectations, expectations about what? So if you want to advance in terms of modeling this, expectations, what do people in the organization have? What do people around the organization have in terms of the expectations? What does it mean? And then what does this visible hand actually do? I like the picture of the visible hand, but what does that actually do? Okay, that's one point I picked up from the papers and the presentation. Then moving to the visible hand and competition, obviously more the strategy space. I very much like the idea of broadening the scope in terms of not within organizations, but also between organizations, and thinking about governance, not just within an organization, but across different types of organizations. What is the market anyways? And I think it very naturally connects to the strategy field as well. Obviously, there's old work, and you mentioned alliances, Bob, work by Joanna Oxley. She was a student of Williamson, and not surprisingly, she took the transaction cost perspective, said, like, how do we think about that between hierarchy, a firm, and the market when we think about alliances, and then whether or not we should have equity stake or non-equity stake. And so what you every time what we tend to do is then take these dimensions of transaction cost and try to kind of like fiddle with them so that we kind of like find our organizational type fits somewhere in between firms and markets. I think we need a broader perspective. And I think, Bob, that's what you're trying to do, this broader perspective in terms of governance, in terms of creating this visible hand. Similarly, the formal theory in strategy, the value-based strategy, started off by Brandenburger and Stewart, very much thinks about these interactions. You have a set of firms that might offer similar products. They need inputs from suppliers, and they tailor to certain customers, and then coalitions form between certain suppliers with certain firms, with certain customers. So you automatically have kind of not just a firm, but you're thinking about governance within a coalition. It's a cooperative game theory model, so you're thinking about which possible coalitions exists and what is going to be the outcome, the core. Well, I won't get into too much formal detail here. But I think this raises interesting issues when thinking about competition. For example, is Apple really competing with Samsung? Or is it Apple together with the app developers, together with their equipment manufacturers, together with their manufacturers, competing with the system of Samsung? And how is that governed? How are expectations created in that system versus the system of Samsung? To just make things more complicated, Samsung will also be a supplier of Apple, so for certain components. So how do we actually look at that? Also, it makes it natural to think about platforms and the governance of platforms, kind of like extending this visible hand across different organizations. Or ecosystems, here another word that we have a hard time exactly defining. But so, moving from looking at visible hand and competition, so you mentioned that it's not such a big jump to think about the visible hand can be a source of competitive advantage. So, and in that sense, culture would affect strategy and can create competitive advantage or could create a competitive disadvantage. But I think there's these two elements are very important. So talking about whether culture eats strategy for breakfast or for lunch, I don't think really helps us advance very much. We really think about how do they actually interact and create advantage or disadvantage. But then maybe it would also be interesting to think a little bit harder about how do we separate the effect of this visible hand, what does this visible hand do, and thinking about culture with a small c. So how do we actually measure that, and how do we separate that empirically? Okay, then finally, what I find very interesting also is this building this new equilibria. So how do we actually build these new equilibria? And you kind of like passed the ball there, and also to the group in terms of thinking how can we think about building these equilibria. And so here Bob, you say you're an economist, organizational economist, but actually I think you're completely a strategist when you're thinking about building equilibria. Because if we define strategy, as Eric van den Steen has formally done, as the smallest set of choices that optimally guide other choices, so that would mean, why not building this new equilibrium? That's basic. And I think it's actually very important because you refer to Mintzberg, where we have this kind of, I find, artificial distinction between, on the one hand, strategy formulation, and on the other hand, execution. But when we're thinking about building this equilibrium, when we're actually managing this way to realize our strategy here, we're actually making this connection very explicit and also thinking to model this very explicitly. So I think it's very interesting, and it's a core question in strategy that we might have lost. Actually, in the session with Ruth and Rudy and Fabrizio mentioned that, referring back to Barnard. Well, actually, the idea was that the top management team builds the organization and builds the culture. We've lost a lot of that research actually in the strategy area, and I think it's an important thing that we need to think more about, and this building equilibrium might actually be helpful in thinking about that. I wanted to raise maybe two questions and issues in building equilibria and the role of things that we've been researching in the field. One is complementarity. Paul raised the issue in his talk in terms of the effectiveness of boards, that we should think more holistically about many different elements of governance come together and have an effect. They are complementary, so we have mutually reinforcing decisions. So that's what complementarity basically means, going back to Milgram-Roberts. But also in the strategy field, we've thought somewhat about more contextual complementarity. Some decisions are mutually reinforcing, or more likely mutually reinforcing in certain environments. And here is exactly where this visible hand might be guiding that complementarity, might be actually pushing that complementarity while building the equilibrium. A second issue is commitments. So what's the role of commitments in building an equilibrium? And here's some, this goes back obviously to creating these irreversibilities, and typically it was thought about important physical decisions. But just recently we have been thinking about how relevant is commitment when we think about digital platforms. Does commitment still have value? And so there we found that in many cases you can actually find cases where at the starting point, an organization that's trying to build a digital platform makes certain governance commitments. For example, Upworks kind of like tries to match freelancers with companies, and it made the freelancers pay for that, and the companies got free access. When that whole industry started developing, actually that was not the dominant model. The dominant model was to make the companies pay and get the freelancers to associate. Switching that ex-post became very difficult, very hard for the organization. So it's important to think about these commitments that made to governance in order to kind of like build this equilibrium. And finally, I really like the idea of stories. I mean, I think this resonates very well in a business school like IESE, where we use cases all the time to kind of like transmit knowledge. But where you looked at it as kind of like the storytelling, and we talk about Nordstrom and how people behave in certain situations to kind of like bridge this knowing telling gap. If you think reversely about strategy and building this equilibrium, well, then nothing exists necessarily. And so you might want to think about analogies. And so there's some research there, and I'm referring to the more popularized version by Gavetti and Rifkin in Harvard Business Review, but using analogies, for example, the Dell case, in terms of how you customize your computers and you sell to order, rather than that you build first and then sell from stock, has been used in many different companies and many different industries as an analogy to move to more customization. Similar things have happened in servitization as well. So leveraging kind of stories, but good analogies to actually build this equilibrium. I'm going to stop here, but very interesting food for thought. I'm very excited about you moving to the strategy field. So thank you very much for this, Bob.
Thank you, Bruno. Bob, would you like to react to some of Bruno's comments?
Sure, if I could just say three quick things. Well, four. First of all, Bruno, thank you. I'd happily be a strategy person if you'll have me, so we could talk more. Okay, my three substantive things on, does the extent of environmental fluctuation or technological change matter for either or both of clarity or credibility? I think that's great. The repeated games literature is all about how the extremes are what will break the credibility aspect of a relational contract. Let me point out two things about the clarity aspect. First of all, clarity is endogenous. Yeah, you could, if you name something that's clearer, it might also be easier to copy. So you may not be so good on competitive advantage, but in response to an environment with lots of fluctuations, you might decide to name something that's clearer as your intended strategy pair. To put that differently and to look ahead to my third point about Eric Van Densteen's work, I think I would focus here not just on clarity, but on clarifying. What are the processes and what events are you waiting for and hoping to exploit in an attempt to build greater clarity along the way, particularly in a world with lots of uncertainty, as you were describing. Secondly, about Brandenburger and Stewart, you're of course exactly right. It's cooperative game theory, which assumes, in my view, too much contractibility, right? We're going to be in the core. We're going to get a coalition of the whole. And that's not what Sired and March taught us, I think, for organizations. And so I'm going to say the same thing about Eric's 2017 work on what is a strategy. Both of these are fantastic, Brandenburger, Stewart, and Van Densteen. And they did what they did by sweeping a certain problem under the rug. So I would like to reinvestigate Brandenburger, Stewart, and say, whoops, we don't have all that contractibility that's assumed in the core and in Biform games. And likewise, to finish, I'd like to reinvestigate Eric. I'd like, Eric and I to reinvestigate Eric, or maybe we need a young person at our ages. But in a sense, he's also swept under the rug or assumed away the problem that I'm trying to get to. And so I would like to see what happens if you go back to his situation and say, what happens if we might not be in equilibrium? What if I'm aiming for something where it's not possible to specify the smallest number of moves that make everything else fall into place, right? His goal kind of prevents analyzing the problem I'm trying to surface. So thank you for all of those. I really appreciate it. Let me get out of the way.
Thank you. So the time has come for the audience to pose any questions or comments that you would like to share. Okay, while people get started on that, Bob, you started talking about the non-integrated organizations, right, which is not the market, involving more than one organization and so on. How do you get started there to create the relational contract when there is uncertainty not only about the environment, but also about the behavior of the counterpart?
Well, your work is on half of that problem, right? That is, as I tried to illustrate from Williamson, he thinks, and I think too, you have exactly that same issue, not only between two counterparties in an alliance, but between two division heads in a firm. So it's a great question, but it isn't specific to the alliance non-integrated side. And then to start towards answering the question, that's again what I think isn't yet in Eric Van Densteen's 2017 paper, right? The idea that, okay, I have to do something to try to build a shared understanding of how we're going to create value together, whether it's two firms in an alliance or two divisions in a firm. And, Bruno asked, okay, what do visible hands do? I'm going to spend my last 10 years, or some of them, trying to think about visible hands telling stories as a first step towards, how are we trying to collaborate together?
Yeah, well, if I may, I think that there is a difference between divisions and organizations in that divisions have a common organizational context that gives them some common ground to get started, while that's not necessarily the case in alliances, but anyway.
Well, and so maybe that's the first thing that needs to be done, that they're behind. It's tougher in the alliances problem. I mean, you could also have told me that 2 divisions have 1 boss as well, which the alliances don't have. But, you know, the view I'm trying to propose is this problem of building an equilibrium is not the only problem inside an organization, and it's not the only problem in an alliance. And it may be a different kind of problem or different severity in the 2 settings, but it's there.
Questions, comments? We have one from the online audience. What could be the distinction between trust and culture in the context of the discussion?
Yep, that's a classic one. I see that too. I pretty much try to not to use the word culture, and I even more try not to use the word trust in a game theoretic model. So Williamson, Yamagishi and Yamagishi, Karen Cook, a big survey with Ron Burt, Sim Sitkin, Colin Kammerer, and I'm probably forgetting people, maybe Denise Rousseau. Let's not confuse. It seems to me that calculative trust is an oxymoron. What's going on in these game theoretic models is, I think, better called assurance, which I think is what Yamagishi and Yamagishi called it. So I want to save trust for something that I'll say is more behavioral than anything that I've said so far today.
Marco, the mic.
Yeah, thank you, Bob, for this great talk. So we've talked before today about control of the organization, and you made a very persuasive case for the visible hand building something you might call culture. But in your view, who controls the visible hand, or maybe who should control the visible hand? And, you know, for example, Williamson said shareholders are the weakest party, therefore they should have control. Is that an anachronism?
Oh gosh, another word. You know, we theorists get to pick our tidy little environments. So in addition to not dealing with real trust, yeah, I heard that discussion with you and Paul and Alex. Let me back up. So I also heard Rudy talking about categorization, and I was thinking not only of the Mike Hannon et al. Stuff that he talked about, but Ezra Zuckerman, who's of course my colleague and works on similar things. And Ezra has gone on to work on the control of voice. So who's allowed to speak for the organization, both inside it and outside it? And it seems to me that if one's going to think about stories, if that's the little part of the visible hand that I'm going to wind up thinking about, that's related to voice. Who is it? And it's not obvious that the CEO has unilateral control over the stories in the organization. I think, if anything, it's obvious that the CEO does not have unilateral control, and that too is a political equilibrium. That if, you know, the janitor starts a better story, a better narrative, as is a popular term these days, let's watch how that takes off. And so, you know, Bob Schiller's work and Elias and Spiegler and so on are in that neighborhood. I hope to steal from them, but I think just like Brandenburger and Stewart have acceptably strong assumptions for the work that they were doing about full contracting and the core and the coalition of the whole, but they need to be weakened in order to get to stories. Likewise, I'm a fan of a view that says that control is contested all the time. rather than a view that locates control at one place. And I'd like to see that get some airtime too. I see we're out of time, so I'll be quiet.
Are we on? Okay, it was until quarter two. Well, thank you very much. Are we out of time? Yeah. Thank you very much, Bob, for a very inspiring talk. And thank you, Bruno, for your comments, which have also sparkled thinking. Thank you all.
Thank you.